Moving forward, that's the old one. We'll go with this one. Or I should say, starting out, we have so far mentioned 2 out of the 5 key passages of the Old Testament. What are those 2? Anybody remember? All right, so the first one is Genesis 3. What happens in Genesis 3? Okay, so this is, we often refer to it, even though the word isn't actually used in Genesis 3, we refer to it as the fall. This is the fall of the perfection that you find in Genesis 2, Genesis chapters 1 and 2, and you see it in Revelation as well, right? That's really where it starts, is to see Genesis 1 and 2, and then to see Revelation and say, okay, well, what happens between those? So Genesis 3 describes the problem. What is the second key passage? Okay, Genesis chapter 12. Very good. And what do we find in Genesis chapter 12? All right, the promises to whom? Okay, so the promises to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And what 3 did we focus on? All right, nation, land, seed. That they would become a great nation. That nation would be given a very specific land. And eventually, that in him, in his seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Which means we have 3 more to go. We will unlock one of those doors this evening. Last week, do you remember where we ended up our discussion? In fact, the bulk of our discussion was really all about what chapter? Yeah, Exodus chapter 19. In Exodus chapter 19, remember, he said, tell the nation of Israel this, you are a what? To me, you are a kingdom of priests. You are a holy nation. And as we talked about those descriptions, what did we determine that meant? Okay, that the nation of Israel, you have God, and then you have the world, and Israel stands what? All right, Israel stands between as a priesthood. So that means that the nation of Israel serves as a priesthood between all of the rest of the world and God. And so they're supposed to show that or demonstrate that in both directions, that they would speak, that they would be there on behalf of the world towards God, and they would be there on God's behalf for the rest of the world. So this is the way that God establishes it. And just as he establishes the priesthood for Israel, what did he do to establish the priesthood? Which we haven't really talked about fully yet. We talked about it last week. But how did he make people know who the priests were? Say it again. All right. Try it really loud. Sean has a hard time with this, so that's why I always harp on it, just to watch him squirm. Say it really loud for the people in the back. Yeah, he gave them special laws, right? They have a special set of laws that are peculiar to them, that are not given to the rest of the world. And that's what makes them set apart or holy in order to serve as that priesthood. So, as we move forward now in chapter 20 and then 21 through 23, what we see is the beginning of this special law set law code that's given to them that makes them holy among all the other nations and gives them the right to be priest, to be a priesthood for all the other nations. What do we call this special law that they're given? Okay, it begins, yes, and right at the very beginning, Exodus chapter 20, it's going to begin with the Ten Commandments, which is the beginning of what? All right, just the law of Moses, right? The Mosaic law that's given. And as was just stated in Exodus chapter 20, we have, for the first time, the Ten Commandments. This is a pretty big deal for these people. This is going to be reiterated again in Deuteronomy, and we'll talk about why that is later. But as he starts off in Exodus chapter 20, after letting them know what they're going to be, God spoke all these words saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You will have no other gods before me, right? Number one, you will not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything in heaven above, the earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third, the fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor, do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you, your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, your livestock, the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father, your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male servant, his female servant, his ox or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. All right, so let's talk about these just very, very briefly. What is the setup for him giving these 10 commandments? It's a little subtle, but I think it's important that we see that. Before he says, you shall have no other gods before me. Why? Okay, because he's the one true God. Very good. But what else? What does he say there? Okay, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. In other words, God's relationship that he has with the people and why it is that he can have this authority over them rests not in who he is as much as what he has done. He's a God of action, of relationship, a God who works among his people. He works, actively works among his creation, that he has condescended. He has stepped down and he has done this and said, I have specifically chosen you. Mike, I have specifically chosen you out of all the nations. I've brought you, I've helped you. Therefore, this is how I now expect you to live. Yeah, Ryan?
In Wednesday's class in relation to his wrestling team, but it's interesting that we've come all this way and we're just now getting the law. And he's just now saying, put no other gods before me. there was idolatry in other cultures previous to this, but now, God's just now saying this. Not that he may not have, he didn't communicate it in other ways, but
Yeah.
it's written down in stone now.
Absolutely. And that is a really good way to think about God's action in the world. Could God have simply kicked Adam and Eve out of the garden and said, look, you've messed up this relationship, knowing that it was going to take blood being shed in order to bring them back? Could they not have just walked out of the garden and Jesus standing there and him saying, hey, you need to crucify me, and that'll take care of it? Could they have done that? Theoretically, but why not? Would they have understood? Would they have grasped the concept? How much of what we see is God working in the very specific time that God is working? That he waits through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Jacob's children, and however long it is that they're there in Egypt, and that entire time before, as Ryan points out, now he finally steps up and says, oh, by the way, this is what I'm doing to make you a holy nation. I am the Lord your God. Don't have any other gods, right? I mean, that he has a very strict set of time, a time frame that he's working with, and he doesn't rush it. He does things exactly as he determines that he's going to do them. So, again, the relationship that he has with these people is based in his action, not in his potential. That is not to say because he's a great God and he could do things these people needed to obey them. He's already done great things. And he says, I will continue to do these great things with you. Just very quickly, I don't want to discuss all of these things with the Ten Commandments because I really, really want us to get into specifically chapter 24. But the very first one, you shall have no other gods before me, literally in my presence, in front of my face is kind of the idea. He's like, they're gone. And to go to Ryan's point as well about these other gods, there's a pretty clear indication, at least I think the way Stephen talks about them, that Abram probably worshipped other gods before he was confronted by Yahweh. The way that Joshua stands up in Joshua 24, remember he says, you've got three choices right now before you today. You could either serve the gods that anybody remember? All right, serve the gods that your fathers served in the land of Egypt, or serve the gods of the Amorites in the land which you're going to possess, right? As for me and my house, what does he say? We'll serve the Lord. We'll remember that one, right? That, really propagandish moment that he has to guilt trip them all into following him, right? Yeah, we remember that. But it starts off with him saying, yeah, our gods, we know that they worshipped other gods when they were in Egypt. That's what our forefathers did. There's other stuff. There are other gods. There's other worship. But God is saying right here and right now, he's making a very clear statement, as Ryan said, right here, right now, that all ends, and you will recognize that I am God alone. The next thing he says is no graven images that are in the image of anything that has been created. Don't necessarily conflate this with the first one. I think these are two separate commands because probably the single most iconic violation of the second command is what? Anybody? When you think of the violation of making an image they shouldn't have made to worship it, what comes to mind? All right, the golden calf in chapter 32. Who were they worshiping with the golden calf? It was an idol, but they were worshiping Yahweh. They said, remember what Aaron said when the calves just popped out, And he's like, behold your gods who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. In other words, he's saying, this is Yahweh. And so they made a golden calf to worship the one true God with. That is a violation of the second command. It's not a violation. They're not serving other gods. They're serving the one true God, but they're doing it by making an image. And I think it's important as well to realize why that's the case. Does anybody know where, and I could be wrong, but I'm pretty confident the first time the word idol appears in the Bible? It's Genesis chapter 1. Let us make man in our idol, our image. It's the first time that the word is there. It's the same word that you find. In other words, the problem with creating these images to represent God, God's like, I've already made my image in the world. Focus on that one. That's the one that I've put. Therefore, none of these other ones. Taking the name of the Lord in vain, sure. Emptily saying his name could be appropriate. But I think this has more to do with what we were saying this morning. Take the name of Jesus with you. Remember, we sang that song. That is the idea of proclaiming that you are God's. That you take his name and you say, I am a Christian, or I am a God server, a God-fearer. That you proclaim to the world, I am God's, and then you just totally live however you want to live, ignore his laws, do all kinds of sinful stuff, and then you say, yeah, but I'm attached to God. You've taken his name, but did you mean it? No, it was empty. Your taking his name was empty. It was vain. You didn't really mean it, and now you have smeared his name by attaching it to you and then going and doing all kinds of sinful stuff. I think that's the more appropriate understanding of taking the name of the Lord your God in vain. That is, not meaning it when you become a Christian for us, because Christ is the Lord, our God, right? But for them to enter into this covenant, which I'm pointing at but hasn't happened yet. So I'm pointing at what is going to be on the board a little bit later, them entering into a covenant, that they enter into it and then ignore what they've promised to do. That would be taking the name of the Lord their God in vain. Honoring the Sabbath, remembering the Sabbath, keeping the Sabbath holy. He's introduced the Sabbath already. The first time when they collected their manna. And then, on the seventh day, now he's giving meaning to this. And he says this is a day of rest, a Sabbath for the Lord. I think the idea behind this, because it is connected to creation. Verse 11, he connects it to the 6 days that God worked. On the seventh day, he rested. Not because he was tired and needed a break. He rested because he wanted the proper relationship with his creation. And he says, you know what we're going to do? We're going to pretend every 7 days like Genesis 3 never happened. And you are going to focus on your relationship with me. I am going to take care of you. You don't have to do hard work or labor, the sweat of your brow, all that fun stuff. You don't have to do that on day number 7. We're going to have a modified idea of what creation is all about. And then eventually we're going to have a whole Sabbath system where you have the days, and then you have the Sabbath year, and then the Sabbath year of Sabbath years, the year of Jubilee, and then ultimately the Jubilee of all Jubilees, being the one that Jesus opened the scroll and talked about, where he says, today this has been fulfilled in your hearing. Honor your father, your mother. Your days may be long in the land the Lord your God's giving you. Paul points out this is the first commandment that comes with a what? All right, so first one that comes with a promise. And I think the idea behind this is if you treat your parents with respect, if you treat them, you honor them, especially into their old age, as Jesus talks about, and you help them, you take care of them, you're going to prolong their lives. Who's watching you do that? Okay, God. Who else? Your own children are watching. What are they learning? That when you reach that old age, you've trained them to be respectful, to take care of you, to help you, and that'll prolong your days, right? And then the same thing. It should be a cycle that just continues if people honor father and mother. These next ones are just pretty easy. Don't murder. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. Don't bear false witness against your neighbor. This is a particular form of lying by which you mess up the sanctity of justice. And don't covet. Covet your neighbor's house or wife or servants or animals, anything that is your neighbor's. And I think this one is also a violation of basically your relationship that you have with your neighbor. And I will say this, if you spend your entire life simply coveting what your neighbor has, first of all, it's going to mess you up because you can't find contentment with what you have, but also it's going to take away your opportunity to have a proper relationship with your neighbor in which you weep when they weep and you rejoice when they rejoice. If you spend your life coveting everything they have, then you will rejoice when they weep and you will weep when they rejoice. It messes that whole dynamic up. And I think it's important that we see that. All right, so I flew through those, but again, I didn't want to get too bogged down because this is not, some people put Exodus 20 as the third key passage. You know, for those of you who are familiar with some of these lists or whatever, I don't. Exodus chapter 20 is the beginning. Really, you could say 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24 are kind of all of a big package. And 24 is what it all builds up to. And 24 is, I think, the real heart of what's happening here. So you have 20, and then especially 21 through 23 are often, they're called the book of the covenant. And then after these laws are given, you get to Exodus chapter 24. In Exodus chapter 24, we're going to start in verse 3. Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord, all the rules, and all the people answered with one voice and said, what did they say? What's their answer? What's their response? Yeah, everything that God has said, we'll do. We will be obedient, right? And so Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning. He built an altar at the foot of the mountain with 12 pillars, according to the 12 tribes of Israel. He sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings, sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half the blood, put it in basins, and half the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant, read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all the Lord has spoken we will do, we will be obedient. And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. All right, so Exodus chapter 24. Let's get a good feel for what's happening here. He reads the book of the covenant before the people, right? What's the book of the covenant again? Yeah, Exodus 21, 22, 23. These are just kind of the first of the laws. There's going to be more, but this is enough for them to get a feel for what the expectations are. And he reads, they say, everything that God has spoken we will do. He makes an altar, kills a couple bulls. What do they do with the blood? Okay, all right. Somebody else besides Josie, who's tearing up all of these things. She's got this down really well. What do they do with this blood? Okay, sprinkle it on everything. Yes. The first thing they do, though, is what? Let's go in order. Okay. Okay, the first thing they do is put half of it in a basin, right? So in other words, they've separated out the blood, they put half in a basin, and then the other half, what do they sprinkle with it? The altar. So they sprinkle it with the blood of the altar, they read the covenant again, and what do the people do? They say it again. All that the Lord has spoken, we will do, we will be obedient. And then what do they do with the half of blood that was set aside? Yeah, they sprinkle that all over the people. And I don't know if they made all the people, everybody gets a drop, or somehow, or, if it's just the first few rows kind of get it, whatever the case might be. It's a symbolic gesture, and we understand that to be the case. But what's the point of this? It sounds kind of gross, doesn't it? I mean, let's just start, like Elijah said just a second ago, they just sprinkle blood all over everything. You know what? What's the point? Does it seem weird to anybody else? A little bit? Yeah? All right, well, let's talk about then the significance of what is taking place here. This covenant, this blood is called the what? Just gave it away. Okay, the blood of the covenant. What's a covenant? We talked about this, I think, on Wednesday even, unless I'm mistaken. Okay, very good. Samuel said it's a relationship between God and Israel. A covenant, it's like a contract that's made, where two parties make a contract, except a covenant is a little more personal. And in this covenant, as Samuel said, it's between God and Israel. God says, I will be your God. And the people say, we will be your people. All that the Lord has said we will do, we will be obedient. So, if they're entering into a contract, what's the blood all about? Let me ask this. How many of y'all have ever, bought a car, house, something like that, where you had to go into a place and they gave you a stack of papers? What'd you have to do with those papers? You had to put your Herbie Hancock on them, right? Every one of them? John Hancock, yes, that's another reference. Anyway, yes, I know it was John Hancock, just so you know. Anyway, yes, you have to sign all of these things. Have you bought that house or that car or that whatever? Have you bought that if you have not signed the paper? No, it's necessary, right? You have to sign that, and then it becomes legally binding. So what do you think the blood was all about? Say it again. The blood is the ink. It's the means of signing this contract. That as the blood is sprinkled upon them, they are signing a contract. Why do they say all that the Lord has said we will do and we will be obedient? What is that? Terms and conditions. That's exactly it. They're agreeing to the terms. The terms have been laid out for the contract. They agreed to the terms. They sign the contract with blood, and it makes it legally binding. So they are now in a legally binding contract, covenant relationship with God. But what's up with the altar? Why would they sprinkle the altar? Seems weird, doesn't it? Okay, Elijah just says, because it represents God. How many parties are there in a contract? It's two parties. You sprinkle the blood on the people, that's one party. You sprinkle the blood on the altar, which kind of stands in for God, because God himself cannot physically be a part of this. And so it's almost like, a power of attorney type of a thing. It stands in, it represents God in this contract. They sprinkle the blood on the people, they sprinkle the blood on the altar, and now they are tied together by this blood, with the idea behind the blood being, if anyone should violate this contract, then what happened to the bulls to have this blood is what should happen to you. That's kind of the idea behind this. So, they have the blood. They've now signed this contract together. By the way, just something to throw out and consider. How many tablets were there for the 10 Commandments? 2. Is that because God's handwriting was just really big? We usually have it where you have the first 4 or 5 on one, then you have the next 5 on the other one. God's handwriting, it was on stone. It's hard to write small on stone, right? You think that was the case? Why do you think there were 2 tablets? Okay, you need to be quiet up here. You're answering too many. Why do you think there are 2 tablets? Anybody? Dale? What?
One for each party
Yeah. Yeah, both parties get a copy of the contract, don't they? You have a copy, the bank has a copy, right? You have 2 copies of the contract. What did they do with one of the copies? Anybody remember? They kept a copy of the 10 Commandments where? In the Ark of the Covenant. Why? Because that's God's copy. It goes in his place, right? All of this should kind of bring to our mind exactly what's taking place in Exodus chapter 24. They are entering into a covenant together, and when they do so, before this was just a large group of people that had been brought out of the land of Egypt, now they are what? They are a nation before God. Exodus 24 is the moment that they take God to be their king. They submit to him they submit to his authority. And Exodus 24 is the birth of the nation of Israel. They're no longer just a bunch of tribes or peoples that are loosely connected. This is now the nation that God has made to be his kingdom of priests, his holy nation. And it happens here in Exodus chapter 24, which is why Exodus 24 is now the third. We've now gotten to the third key passage of the Old Testament, and this is the covenant. Everybody see all of this? All right, so we're good now. Understanding Exodus 24, it's important. The covenant concept that you find here, the contract that they've made together. And he calls witnesses. You see this when you go through Deuteronomy especially, where you have a lot of this covenant terminology reiterated. And he'll call mountains to be witnesses of what it is that they have done. All right. As you move forward, now that God has established the fact that this is his nation, which, by the way, now that they're a nation, what have we fulfilled? All right, remember? Nation. I meant to write this up earlier, and I didn't. Land, then seed. They're now a nation. The first promise made to Abraham has been fulfilled. God has made them a nation. Now what should we expect? That God is going to take this nation and plant it in a specific land. the land that he'd promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now that he has made them this nation, what is God ultimately going to do through the rest of Exodus? Okay, well, not quite yet, not bring them to the land quite yet. The first thing that he's going to do, we'll go ahead and look at chapter 25. What does he give them? Starts to give them the plans for what? The plans for the tabernacle. Well, that seems weird. Of all the things that he should start talking about, why not just go immediately into their priesthood, their sacrifices, the various laws or things? Why is the very first thing that he tells them when they become a nation, they enter into a covenant, the very first thing that he says is, all right, here are the plans for the tabernacle. Kelly? Okay. He wants to be with them. Why do they need the tabernacle then? All right. The tabernacle, Kelly said, is a special place for him to be. In other words, it's like they're, yes, God is going to use language of their covenant relationship as a marriage. He's going to use the illustration of a marriage. It's almost like they're getting married and God is moving in. He says, build me my place. So he gives them the commands for the tabernacle, how to build the tabernacle, so that he can come and, in a sense, he can live among them as their God. And it's a tabernacle, which means what? Now you get to play the Read Chris's mind game. There's all kinds of answers you could give, but I'm looking for a certain one. By the way, what's a tabernacle? What's another word for it? Tent. Which means that God can now what? What's that? Okay, he can dwell with them, camp with them, but there's another. He can move with them. Remember, in their ideas of time or God and space and everything like that, oftentimes gods were relegated to certain geographic types of areas. And he's demonstrated that he's not tied to that by virtue of what he did to the Egyptian gods, right? And now he's still not in the land. They're still not there. But he says, you know what? Build me my house here, my tent, so I can move in with you. And it's a tent so that as you move, I'm right there. I'm always going to be where you go. And I will stay with you. Mike, I will, up here. I will stay with you as you travel. I will travel. In fact, we know he's going to be the one to actually lead them. Yeah, John?
I think their notoriety is already seen by the other people of the world, going back to that aspect of it. And when they begin to see the tabernacle coming, I think they referred to them as tent people. Those tent people are coming. Those tent people are over there in the valley. And they knew what that represented as far as the power and the image of what God had did for them in their struggles and their battles and things like that. And I think that carries through with this thought.
Yeah, there's going to be some significance, especially as the peoples recognize who and what Israel is. Especially, we know when they go into Jericho, even 40 years later, that they're going to say, yeah, we're scared to death because we know about you and we know about your God who lives among you. I think there's definitely significance to that. So he gives them the plans, and there are probably many aspirations to read through the Bible in a year that find their demise in this section because it is just boring reading. It's so detailed. Even down to how many rings that you want to have on the pole or the curtain that holds things up. I mean, it's but it can be interesting if you want it to be. But it is at least interesting. There's lots of skilled labor people that are specified to do the various jobs. They have the items to do it. How do they have the items to do it? Because there's a free will offering, but where did they get all this stuff? They brought it out of Egypt for the specific purpose of having a free will offering to make this. And so this is where a lot of this, the gold and the cloth and all the other stuff that they plundered from Egypt, they did so. God told them to do it very specifically so that when it came time to build his house, they would be able to do so. Well, you read through all of this through chapter 31, and then you get to chapter 32. In chapter 32, the people, they say, man, Moses walked up into that fiery mountain. And remember, we didn't talk about it, but you go back, and you look in chapter 20, 19 and 20, where the Ten Commandments, God actually spoke them from a mountain where there was smoke billowing, earthquakes, thunder and lightning, and all kinds of stuff. God speaks from the mountain, and the people are terrified. And they're just like, you know what, Moses? Never again. You got to stand between us because we can't take this anymore. So Moses goes up by himself. Enough time passes, been about 40 days or so, and they're just like, well, I guess he's dead. What now? And Aaron's like, tell you what, give me your what? Give me your gold. And what does he do with that gold? All right. He makes a golden calf, or golden calves. It could be either way. The way that he says, behold your God or your gods, who did what? All right, brought you up out of the land of Egypt. We talked about this a minute ago, right? This kind of violates something, doesn't it? What does this violate? Yeah. You go back to the top 10, and this is number 2 right here. We've already done it, right? And it's not that they're worshiping Baal. It's not that they're worshiping the Ashtoreth. They're not going back to Ra or any of the Egyptian gods. Or who are they worshiping? Yeah, Yahweh, the God who brought them up out of Egypt. But they're doing it in the form of this golden calf. And who in particular didn't really care for this? Well, even before Moses, but yes. Well, this one's an easy one. You're overthinking it. Yeah, God. God is like, hey, Moses, by the way, down there, you should know what's going on because they are totally messing up completely and violating the law that's been given to them. I mean, what was it that they said when they entered into this covenant? Yeah, all that the Lord has said, we will do. We will be obedient until 40 days later. And yeah, okay, well, never mind now. I mean, and you just have to wonder about this group of people, although we've already seen time and again where maybe their faith wasn't quite as strong through the testing narratives and things such as that. But you have this in chapter 32. Moses comes down, and what does he do? All right, he smashes the tablets, right? Now, before we get there, I almost skipped over this. This is important. What does God say to Moses? Let me destroy them, start over with you, right? And I find verse 10, chapter 32 and verse 10, just interesting. What does God say? Okay, let's just focus on the first phrase of that. Leave me alone. Let me alone. Does that strike anybody else as interesting? What's God saying to Moses? Okay. Which means what? Okay, that Moses is involved in. Now, what Kelly said was he told Moses, stay out of this. I think that indicates something, though. What does this indicate? All right, Sean just said this indicates Moses has the ability to do something about this. Let that sink in. The God of all creation and everything, does he need permission to do anything? Could he not just be like, all right? Absolutely. Except that he says to Moses, right now you are the only thing that's standing in my way. Right now, Moses, you are between me and the people of Israel, and I cannot act as long as you stand between us. That is what God is telling Moses. Is that not crazy? That God is saying, Moses, this is the position that you're in. Yeah, Kelly?
Is it because Moses hadn't violated the contract, so
Okay.
God can't?
All right, what Kelly said, is it because Moses has not violated the contract? So there still remains somebody who is faithful to the covenant, and so he cannot do it. That's an interesting thought. I hadn't considered that. I don't necessarily think that that's what it is, but I will definitely have to give some thought to that, because that is interesting. What we do find, though, and we're going to spend some time with this eventually at some point, is with Israel, you always have this large group of people who are in a covenant relationship with God, right? Are they all faithful at any point in their history? No, you just don't find that. And especially in times where it seems like they are completely, totally 100% unfaithful. Take the time of Elijah, right? When he says, look, I'm the only one left. I can't do it anymore. Just take my life and let's just end this thing, because it can't happen. What does God tell him? I still have 7,000, which I think is a figurative number. I don't think he literally means 7,000. I think what he means is I've still got a full complement who have not bowed their knees to Baal. What do we often call that? That group of people who have not? The remnant, right? That's the remnant of faithful. And so there's always that remnant of faithful. And Moses represents, I think, right here, that remnant of faithful, even when everybody else, it seems, Moses and Joshua. Because remember, Joshua went halfway up the mountain. So Joshua's not down there amongst all of this that's taking place. So there is a remnant. I don't know. I'll have to consider that some more. But it seems as if God still brings judgment upon his people. And even then, what's his promise to Moses? I'll do what?
Make a people of you.
Yeah, he's like, you know what? I'm just going to wipe them all out. I'm going to start all over with you. And in so doing, has he not still kept it? I mean, at least, with the one who is still there, it'll just take a little bit, but he'll get back up to what it needs to be to start over a new Abraham, right? And then, bring it back up and keep it going. What's Moses' response? Okay, Samuel said, I can't let you do that. It's more imploring. He says, don't do this. And I guess for the sake of time, we'll just kind of look at it. Why should the Egyptians say with evil intent, he brought them out to kill them in the mountains, consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven. And it says in verse 14, one of the craziest, I think, places, because we have this idea of God as an absolute sovereign, and yet he relents. He changes his mind. He does something different from what he had said that he would do based on the prayer that's offered by a single righteous man. That's crazy to think that the God of all creation can be veered off of one course on to another course. You would think that his course is always just absolute, perfect, the only way, the only good possible way. And yet we see Moses who prays and veers him to a different course than what he had originally intended. And this isn't the only time. You see prayers of men who stand up between God and others throughout the Scriptures that causes God to intervene in ways that he would not otherwise have done. All right, you have 5 times through here that God and Moses interact in chapters 32, 33, 34. Chapter 34 is incredibly important. It's not one of the key passages because it doesn't drive the story forward. That's what these key passages are. These key passages are meant to drive the narrative forward and push things forward. This one, in Exodus chapter 34, is a key passage in and of itself because it describes who and what God is. And it's not just the people saying, well, God, I see that you are something, or I believe you are something. This is God himself who, when Moses said, I want to see your glory, he says, yeah, well, let me do you one better. I'm going to tell you who I am. How many of y'all are familiar with Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7? Any of you guys ever spent, any time with about half of this? Not the whole thing, because maybe you might have run out of time to try to get through the whole thing. Could have happened, he comes, the Lord passed before Moses and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children's children, to the 3rd and the 4th generation. Again, we don't have a ton of time to delve into this. We will definitely spend a lot of time on all of these aspects over the course of time, but enough to say, God says to Moses, here's who I am. And he doesn't say, I'm all powerful. He doesn't say, I'm all knowing. He doesn't say, I'm all present. There's no omnis that we think of, the Greek omnis here. What he says is, I step into my creation and I act in a loving way with them. I show grace. I show mercy. I show loving kindness. I show forgiveness. I show punishment. But here's the kicker. Remember what sets all of this up? What has God basically said to Moses? He's like, you know what? Y'all will go on, but what? He's told Moses, I'm not going with you. Because y'all are a stiff-necked people, and this is going to happen again, and I'm probably just going to wipe y'all out when it happens again. And Moses says, that's exactly why we need you. Because we are a stiff-necked people, and we need you here to be the one to guide us, to show us grace and mercy and steadfast love, forgiveness, and to offer. I can't stop right now. I'm out of time. So I'm needing to just barrel through because I want to make it to the end of Exodus here. all of this in Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7, this demonstrates who God is as not just a God that exists. He is the covenant God of Israel, who has a covenant relationship, who has told them, I will be your God. I will protect you. I will take care of you. Those, just as he said to Abraham, those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. He stands there with them. And he forgives them. 40 days in or so, they've already violated this covenant. Don't fool yourself to think that God didn't feel that. He calls himself a jealous God over and over again. He feels it deeply when that which is his rejects him and goes out towards anything else. He is a jealous God, and he feels the fullness of their rejection. But in chapter 34, what does he tell Moses to do at the very beginning? Bring a couple more tablets. Our story's not over. We're going to do this again. And he writes out the 10 Commandments yet again, so that their covenant is firmly established. And he says, I will be with you. And we know that because you read through the rest of Exodus, and it sounds almost exactly like chapters 25 through 31. If you thought 25 through 31 was really boring, you're going to get a second dose of it right here. But repetition's really important in the Hebrew Bible. And this is a lot of repetition, which shows just how important and significant this is. And it concludes in chapter 40. Exodus concludes, verse 34, the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. What does God do? He moves in. Even though Exodus 32 happened, they're on the other side of this. Forgiveness has been given, and God says, I'm still going to live in this house that you've made. I will be your God, and you will be my people. And that's how Exodus comes to its conclusion. Next week, we will move forward from Exodus. We're going to talk a little bit about the rest of the law of Moses, and we'll probably spend a decent amount of time in the middle of Numbers. All right. I'm over time. I was going to say any comments or questions, but I'm over time. So, very good. We got through the rest of this. We will now turn things over to Richard.